Welcome to the Disability and podcast. I'm Colin Hambrook, the founding editor of Disability Arts Online, and I'm delighted to be speaking today for the podcast with Dr Colin Cameron, who is an assistant professor at Northumbria University. And Colin recently delivered a paper, Why the Affirmation Model is Important for Social Work Practice, at Sussex University. In essence, the paper critiques the ableism at the heart of the Equalities Act 2010 definition of disability. So, Colin, can you give us an overview of the damage being done to disabled people by the definition that underpins disability legislation?
The main issue is that the disability definition contained within the Equality Act 2010, which is the principal legislation, the key legislation underpinning the professional practice of everyone, including such professionals as social workers, teachers, lecturers, any kind of human service professionals. The definition kind of underpinning their work states that you are disabled if you have an impairment or a long-term condition that has a negative impact on your ability to carry out ordinary everyday activities. Now, it's an individual model, it's a medical model, it's a personal tragedy definition of disability because it identifies disability as caused by impairment, as within the old ICIDH definition, which identified disability as the loss or limitation of ability to carry out ordinary everyday tasks in the manner carried out by a normal human being. So disability in this definition is identified as something that can only be experienced negatively if you have an impairment which has a long-term negative impact on your ability to carry out normal everyday activities. So disability is identified A, as something people have, B, something that can only be experienced negatively. Nothing good can come out of it. There's nothing to be gained. It is something which can only be related to as something unfortunate or as a mark of tragedy, and it is measured as abnormality. So disability is identified again in terms of abnormality, and this means that professionals working within this definition can't do otherwise than to identify disability as something wrong with people. It's a departure from normality. So however much they talk about inclusion and diversity and equality and valuing, we can't move away from an understanding which says, we welcome you, we want you here, we want you to be part of what's going on, we want you to be part of this institution, we want you to be part of everyday life, but only so long as you recognise and we recognise that there's something wrong with you. The definition makes it impossible to go beyond that oppressive understanding of impairment. In terms of disability arts, over the past 40 years or so, we've had all kinds of disabled people, blind people, deaf people, wheelchair users, people with epilepsy, people with emotional distress, people with learning difficulties. Everyone. It's always been about saying, we are who we are. We are proud of being who we are. We have our own identities. As Johnny Crescendo saying, I'm in love with my body, it's the only one I've got. We're saying we're here. This is who we are, this is how we are. And there's much to be gained by the experience of impairment. I can think of, people who I've interviewed who've said, it's hard to know, hard to imagine what I would be like without my impairment. It's impossible. And I don't think I would want to be, different, because I think would be a much more shallow, less sensitive person. I can think of somebody else interviewed who said, I think myself before I became disabled. And she said, I think back to who I was before my diagnosis, and I wasn't happy. But, I think of all the stuff I've learned through the challenges I've experienced, it's given me so much more understanding of life, so much more empathy, so much more, real insight into what the human experience is all about. No end of people have talked about stuff they've gained from that experience. Like say, nobody is saying, impairment is wonderful and it makes life easy and it's not without difficulties and it's not painful and it doesn't cause fatigue or sometimes it's inconvenient, but that's not all it is about. It adds depth to understanding and to experience and relationships with other people. Insight creates empathy, for example. So what I'm saying is, it's fine being who we are. We like being who we are. I would rather not have my impairment. But that kind of understanding is something that the Equality Act definition just can't begin to imagine. And as long as professionals have their practice rooted within this Equality Act definition, as long as they keep, talking about people with disabilities and identifying disability as something people have, something wrong with people, then moving forwards, very, very difficult. And there's a lot of damage done there.
Yeah. Over the last 15 years or so, you've been developing and honing the affirmation model of disability. And it defines disability in the following ways. It defines impairment as physical, sensory, emotional, and intellectual difference, divergent from culturally valued norms of embodiment, to be expected and respected on its own terms in a diverse society. And the affirmation model defines disability as you are disabled if, on a substantial or long-term basis, you have had to deal with other people's oppressive expectations and assumptions about people with impairments, and have on that basis found your life made difficult and your opportunities for equal participation restricted. In many ways, it's an augmentation of the social model and directly opposes the Equalities Act definition as an oppressive tool that locates disability within the individual, as you've been telling us about. Can you talk a bit more about your motivation for developing the affirmation model and how it's being received?
Well, the affirmation model was first suggested and first proposed in a Disability in Society article written by John Swain and Sally French in 2000. And Sally and John's kind of thinking on this, about this, kind of developed from a debate within disability studies and a debate within the disabled people's movement around the social model. And I suppose the term would be the adequacy of the social model to address kind of every single issue there was, which, as Mike Oliver and Colin Barnes and people like that have said at length, the social model was never intended to be the answer to every single question about disability that anyone could ever ask. The critique of the social model came particularly from disabled feminists, people like Jenny Morris and Sally French, Carol Thomas, who were saying that, while the social model gives an understanding of disability in structural terms, it's a sociological interpretation or a sociological understanding of disability. Disability is to do with the way society has organized itself in order to exclude people with impairments, and disability is about the barriers, the physical and social barriers to access ordinary everyday life opportunities. Well, disabled feminists during the 1990s were saying, well, this is great, but in terms of disability politics, while there was a lot of emphasis on addressing the barriers, the physical barriers, the environmental barriers which people excluded, we were, or there was a feeling that we were discouraged from talking about our experience of impairment, because it was felt that if we talked about impairment, then that ran a risk of doctors, for example, being able to say, we told you all along that it was about what's wrong with your bodies. We told you all along. So feminists, disabled feminists were saying, well, social model's great, but it doesn't kind of leave room for talking about the lived, the embodied experience of impairment. Now, on a kind of personal basis, I don't think they exclude the possibility of talking about impairment. Nevertheless, those were the terms of the debate, and John Swain and Sally French made a kind of intervention in this debate when they proposed the affirmation model, which they identified as a non-tragic view of disability. And I remember John telling me, because we used to hold disability arts cabaret events at the Buddle Arts Centre in Wallsend, where I worked, and we would have, comedy, we would have sketches, we would have music, and we would have 150, 200 disabled people in the audience, and it was about identity, it was about affirmation, it was about celebration of who we were, it was about, ridiculing the absurdity in assumptions and requirements for normalcy. The sketches would be about the ridiculous kind of assumptions made by social workers. In particular, social workers came in for a lot of stick and nosy do-gooders and charities and strangers on the street. All these things were laughed at. And we had Johnny Crescent, we had Ian Stanton, singing, chip on your shoulder and choices and rights, and a really strong sense of pride and anger and strength. And John Swain told me, because he and Sally French had been at one of these cabaret events in Wallsend, and he told me that as they left one of those events, Sally said to him, it would be really good to try and capture, because the stuff that happened at those events gave a real sense of it was defiance, it was anger, it was celebration of who we were as disabled people. It was something that, very, very hard to capture or to describe. But Sally said it'd be great if we could kind of try and capture that sense, and kind of turn it into an understanding of disability identity involving strength and affirmation, rather than being understood solely as tragedy or solely understood as something wrong with people, and that's why they came up with their idea of the article was, the 2000 article was entitled Towards an Affirmation Model of Disability, and they said, yes, we what we are proposing is a way of understanding disability, kind of the shifts from a tragedy. Understand, they said, in many ways, it's non-disabled people can actually get their heads around the social model. It makes sense. Yes, disabled people are disabled by steps leading into a building, or they're disabled by poor access. Yes, we can understand that. But the idea that a person with learning difficulties or a wheelchair user could actually be pleased and proud to be who they were, they said this idea freaks non-disabled people out. They can't get their heads around it because it is threatening to their own kind of identity of themselves as normal. If everyone's okay about being who they are, then what's the value in being normal? Well, what do we gain by it? I remember I had thought this model is a great idea, and it says something that hasn't been said elsewhere. It was never intended to supersede the social model. It wasn't a replacement of the social model. It built upon the social model and it addressed this critique by the disabled feminists who said, well, we can't really, social model doesn't allow us to talk about the lived experience of impairment. So the affirmation model was intended as an intervention, as say in this debate. The thing about the article is that while John and Sally told us what the affirmation model was about, and while they told us what the affirmation model was like, they didn't say this is the affirmation model. They didn't give it definitions. We have definitions within the UPIAS definitions and the DPI, the Disabled People's International definitions of social model. We have definitions of impairment, of disability. We know what we are talking about. Even in the medical model, with the ICIDH and the one following that, there were definitions of impairment and disability, so people could say, this is what we're talking about. Mike Oliver has referred to the social model as a hammer for truth and justice. It is a tool to be used in being able to look at and understand what's going on. And the affirmation model, I felt it needed kind of definitions, which is why with John and Sally's agreement, I was successful in putting in gaining a bursary to study for a PhD at Queen Margaret University up in Edinburgh, to look at and to clarify what the affirmation model was, to come up with clear affirmation model definitions, and to that purpose I carried out 48 different interviews with 16 disabled people with a whole range of impairments. I tried to get as diverse a range of people in there, but I talked to them about their own kind of how they'd come to understand the term disability, looked at representations of disability in the media as resources for making sense of experience, and I looked at situations in everyday life to carry out go-along interviews with people and just watching what happened in the midst of everyday life, whether I was going shopping, whether it was making tea, whether it was watching Deal or No Deal on television, just looking at where people encountered disability in ordinary everyday life, and it was from those interviews and making sense of what people had said, people's experiences, that I came up with the definitions of the affirmation model. And disability, it is something imposed on people in interactions with everyday life. And there's a difference between living with impairment, and there's a difference between being disabled by other people's judgments and other people's assumptions in the way other people relate to you and approach you and talk to you. And it's in those details that disability is imposed. So the affirmation model, I would say it's a tool to be used by disabled people in making sense of what is going on in those encounters. A few months ago, I had an article entitled, "I'm living my life as the person I'm meant to be, not in spite of the person I am," right, with one of my PhD students, Laura Smith, who's currently carrying out research on what it means to be a good enough blind parent. In this article, Laura reflects on a recent visit to her by a social worker, during which the social worker spent the whole visit going, "My, you're doing so well. You really are. You're doing very well." She spent 10 minutes basically, as Laura has put it, trying to impose these personal tragedy kind of assumptions on it's marvellous what you've achieved in spite of your being blind. It's great that you've achieved what you have in spite of your terrible situation. That wasn't said, but it was underlying everything the social worker said. And Laura's point was that she said, until recently, I would just have thought, well, this is, the shit that we have to put up with. This is what comes with being a disabled person. We have to deal with patronising professionals, and we have to deal with all this. And she said, normally I would have waited till she'd left, and I would have gone and ranted to my partner. But she said, this time, and I realised the difference the affirmation model has made to my thinking. And as I said to the social worker, Laura said, well, I get on with my life because I want to get on with my life, not in spite of, I do things I want to do because I want to do them, not to prove how I can overcome my terrible limitation. She said, within this house, we believe in disability pride. And I'm okay about being who I am. And she says the social worker sat there nonplussed. She wasn't sure what to say. And a couple of minutes later, she got up and left, a bit confused because Laura had answered her back. It's an open access article, so if you just Google, I'm living my life as the person I'm meant to be, not in spite of the person I am. If you just Google that, you can access the article. Here we have an example where the affirmation model has been used as a practical tool for making sense of a disabling encounter, and it's been used as the basis for making an affirmative response, for saying, bugger off with your assumptions about my personal tragedy, bugger off with your trying to impose your medical model understanding on my situation. Stop that, because I'm not going to allow you to do it anymore. And that really important. And as I've said, all this comes from the voices of disabled people in disability arts cabaret. It's about that collective voice of disabled people saying, this is who we are. So it's a model, and like any model, it's a framework for making sense of the things we encounter in the world. But this is a model which is thoroughly rooted within the voices and the perspectives of ordinary disabled people within the disabled people's movement. And I think that is what gives it its power, and that is what makes it such an important thing. It, like I've said, it is not intended as to replace or substitute or as an alternative to the social model. Without the social model, you could not have the affirmation model, but it's there to be used as well. Whereas the social model enables us to understand disability at a kind of structural level. It's about the way society has organised itself to exclude people with impairments. The affirmation model focuses on the micro level, what happens in interactions and encounters when non-disabled people and disabled people, there are many disabled people who have only ever heard the voices of social workers and parents and have taken all the stuff on board. But when they talk about people with disabilities, and disability is something wrong with people, the affirmation model is a way of responding to that.
It's really interesting though to hear how Laura has taken it and in a very practical way used it as a power and a strength to challenge. It's so hard to do that and to kind of frame yourself within the moment of where oppression happens.
That is why I think this model is important. Speaking personally, and I know hundreds of disabled people have said things similar. Before encountering the social model, and I remember having the social model explained to me sitting in the Akenside pub with the late Jeff Armstrong in 1992, and as he explained this to me, it was like it was a road to Damascus experience. The light went on, and all of a sudden, my whole understanding of everything was transformed. Before that, you kind of knew that something was wrong as a disabled person, and who had experienced prejudice and being judged and being taken as being unintelligent or taken as drunk, going into pubs and saying, "Can I get 2 pints of XB, please?" And the bloke at the bar would say, "I'm not serving you, you've had too much to drink already." Shit like that. You knew there was something unjust about disability, but all you could do was feel that sense of injustice, but not really, couldn't think of a way of doing anything about it. And the affirmation model, like you have just said, Colin, the affirmation model is like that, and I think it's as important as that, because as you say, when you find yourself caught up in the flow of life, in the whole ongoing flow of life, and all of a sudden from out of nowhere there looms some twat who puts you in your place, or who reminds you of how you are seen. And that's on an interactional level, but it could also be some education officer or some teacher or some social worker who is making a judgment about who you are and which has an impact on kind of services or opportunities on what you can do in life. But having the affirmation model, just being able to make those distinctions. Impairment is physical, sensory, emotional, cognitive difference, to be expected and respected on its own terms. It is part of life. It's part of being. It's not unusual. It's relatively common. It's not freakish. It's not odd. It's who we are. But disability is about being on the is about being experiencing those negative assumptions and judgments about impairment. To have that kind of understanding, it does make a difference in how you respond. And Laura's example of a social worker visit is a clear kind of example of how that works and of why it's important.
I think it's hugely important because disability and oppression is so embedded in every institution, every walk of life, so many levels. So I'm keen to ask you what you think that we as disabled people, as disabled activists, as disabled artists, what we can do to challenge that oppression on a practical level.
Well, it's about identify, and one of the great things about being part of the disabled people's movement is in gaining strength from solidarity with other disabled people. There's a psychologist, this guy called David Smale. He's not a disabled person. He was a psychologist based in the Midlands, in Birmingham, writing in the 1980s, 90s. He died in, I think, 2014. But as a psychologist and as a counsellor, he made the point that depression and anxiety are not illnesses. They are rational responses to people's experience of shit in life, to people's experience. They are not illnesses, and the process of medicalization of depression and anxiety is it's all a big it's a big con trick. It's about the use and the abuse of power within society, and Smale was he identified three components of what made a good supportive relationship. It was basically saying, what makes the real difference is for people to have the opportunity to talk and to be listened to and to experience solidarity. And solidarity is about having somebody else on your side. It's having somebody who is with you, who believes you, who listens to you, who agrees with you. And so many people in life don't have somebody else standing alongside them saying, I am with you. And that is something, though, that you get from being a part of the disabled people's movement and from being a part of the disability arts movement. You are with other disabled people and sharing a common experience of oppression. And the affirmation model, like the social model, identifies disability as an oppressive social relationship. The way that so many people in education and arts and community talk about decolonization and colonization, and they talk about this particularly in relation to experience of race and racism, but they have no conception of it as an issue to do with disability and about the way that the disabled people's lives and experiences and existences have been colonized by the non-disabled view. So the impairment can only be experienced as something negative, something that we wish we didn't have, something unfortunate. All that rubbish is part of the colonization of disability, or the colonization of impairment in a society which requires normalcy and requires compliance, requires mediocrity. We resist this, I would say, by being together, by sharing a narrative about disability, about impairment, about the lived experience of impairment, which challenges the colonializing of disability. Two things. One is that by talking to each other, by communicating with each other. And we do that through, for example, through disability arts. You know, every new poem, every new anthology, every new performance, every new exhibition is a development of that discussion, of that conversation that disabled people have started. In terms of, you know, the work of LDAF, for example, and Grey Eye, you know, back in the early 1980s, you know, the work, the conversation has started and has grown up and has developed and continues to develop. I remember back in the 90s, Jeff Armstrong used to go about saying for a while, oh, disability arts is dead. But also remember Ian Stanton and I asked Ian what he thought about the statement, is disability arts dead? And is disability culture dead? And he said, no, I think whenever you have 2 or 3 disabled people coming together to talk and to share their experiences, that is disability culture. We have a shared understanding. And I think, you know, this affirmation model can be placed centrally within that understanding. In conclusion to answering your question, I think have solidarity with each other, but having that solidarity, and this brings us back to the point that the affirmation model is rooted in the voices of other disabled people. That culture that disabled people have developed themselves. So every time somebody thinks of the affirmation model, that is drawing on all of that collective voice, that collective strength. It's having the voices of hundreds, thousands of other people, other disabled people saying, we are who we are. We like being who we are, you know, but we don't like being oppressed. We don't like being excluded. We don't like being patronized. We don't like being judged. We don't like being talked down to. We don't like being told that we're an inspiration. It's drawing on all of that as a resource, as a personal resource. So it's the second thing we can do, to make use of that understanding, to say to people, no, you know, sod off, you know, I am not going to be your plucky cripple or your inspiration or your sad pathetic. This is who I am.
I think those small acts of resistance are so important. There is so much to oppose in the way that disability and oppression is so embedded, so in the foundations of society. But those small acts of resistance are really important.
Yeah.
I think we need to draw the conversation to a close.
So
it's always really interesting to hear you talk and your passion for anti-discrimination, for challenging ableism. And thank you to everyone for listening to the Disability And podcast. And on that note, I'll hope you're all well and listen in. And goodbye for now.
Right. And goodbye from him.
Thank you for listening. We do hope you've enjoyed this episode of Disability And. Further episodes of Disability And can be found on the Disability Arts online website at www.disabilityarts.online.